again, thanks to API for hosting this workshop. It's always difficult to follow a speaker when you hear that he has more experience than you've been on this earth. So 42 years, that's something that's pretty amazing. So thanks for that. So today I'm going to be talking about HF-2, water management associated with hydraulic fracturing. Now you've all seen this map, it's posted over here, but what I really want to point out about this map is look at what we've accomplished since 2006. Our shale gas resources have expanded tremendously. Our resource base continues to rise. And if you look, hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling is due in part why this expansion has been created. So today, for my presentation overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the scope of the HF-2 document. I'm going to talk about API's rationale for developing a water management guidance, and much of that's going to come from my perspective. I'm also going to address it or provide an overview of the HF-2 guidance document, and I'm going to kind of break that up into a table of contents review, and then I'm going to go over some key takeaways for operators to consider. And then I'm going to provide examples in which Devon and other domestic operators are implementing the HF-2 recommended practices. And I've tried to highlight a lot of operators here and show you that this isn't just something that's being put on paper. This is being implemented throughout the U.S. And a lot of these examples I took from research, from other presentations where I've heard them. So if I represent anything incorrectly, I apologize. I'm just trying to show where you're doing good in the field. If you like how I've represented your company, we can meet in the back and you can compensate me accordingly later. No, I'm just kidding. But the scope of this document. So the purpose of this guidance document is to identify and describe many of the current industry best practices used to minimize environmental and societal impacts associated with the acquisition, use, management, treatment, and disposal of water and other fluids associated with the process of hydraulic fracturing. You're going to hear me use hydraulic fracturing over and over and over. Obviously, that's the point of this workshop, so I may shorten that to HF. So from my perspective, why did API develop HF-2? Why was that important aspect, and why HF-2 water use and management? Well, we've all seen the media attention out there around hydraulic fracturing. And from an operator standpoint, we all see hydraulic fracturing, as Ron pointed out, as being a downhole completion process. However, I think this has been expanded by many activists and other groups as to encompass all things associated with oil and gas development. However, water is an integral part of hydraulic fracturing, and water always serves as an energy-water nexus for all energy development. You must have water. So water is a very important piece of that. I think they wanted to develop this so we could ultimately be good stewards of the land. Additional drivers here, obviously, as I pointed out, the escalated attention and scrutiny of shale gas development, the rapid growth and increasing urban interface. We're seeing this in several areas. Several years ago, operators moved right on into the Fort Worth Basin area in the Barnett Shale. We've seen that here in the Marcellus as well. There's increased public transparency through the use of frac focus. So not only are we providing or disclosing the chemical additives we use, but we're also disclosing the water volumes we use associated with hydraulic fracturing. And when they were working on this frac focus, they weren't able to break out essentially what is shown there is the total water volume used for hydraulic fracturing. However, they were unable to break out that source water and depict what comes from recycling and other sources. So it could be slightly skewed to not show how much of that volume is recycled. Also, increased liquids and oil development in arid regions of the U.S., particularly in the western states. Seasonal variations and competing interests for source water. As you all know, we've had substantial droughts in South Texas and flooding here in the Northeast, so you have to account for all these things. And of course, it's a highly polarized issue. Often, if you're not educated about hydraulic fracturing, our industry, water use in general, what you're seeing from the media may drive you to one way or the other, and it becomes highly polarized. It's either you're for it or you're against it. And so I think that's what we're doing here today with this workshop. We're trying to educate not only operators, but the public here. And so also I think that the current administration has a high interest in hydraulic fracturing. As Ron pointed out, I think we're going to need shale gas in a substantial way going forward through 2035, obviously. And so they have an interest in ensuring that we can continue developing this resource but making sure that it's environmentally sound. So EPA's current draft HF study plan takes a full water cycle approach to evaluating water use and water acquisition. In addition to this, the SEAB recommendations, that is the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board, has recently come out with a 90-day interim report, and they've made recommendations concerning water use and management. And if you'll look, both of them kind of have the themes of this life cycle water approach. And in fact, SEAB says that the subcommittee urges adoption of a systems approach to water management based on consistent measurement and public disclosure of the flow and composition of water at every stage of the shale gas production process. And whether or not we as operators agree with everything that is said here, I think that we are making excellent strides towards these goals, and I think that we are moving in this direction. So, as a presentation or a table of contents review of HF-2 particularly, I've broken it up into 3 sections. The first section is water use and management associated with hydraulic fracturing. This is truly going to touch on the downhole fluids, fluid selection, additives that are used, and ultimately that fracture design. The second section here is obtaining water supply for hydraulic fracturing. This is truly touching on how are we getting that water, what are we doing with it, evaluating this source water on a basin-wide analysis. And then last is water management and disposal. That's truly looking at our disposal options for each shale gas basin. So, for water use management associated with hydraulic fracturing. As Ron pointed out, the requirements are the result of geology, the operating environment, the fracture design, the type of well drilled, and the scale of the development process. There's so many variables when we're entering these new basins, and you have a whole team. It's extremely technical, as Ron pointed out, that you have teams evaluating this. But first question, when they're looking at a new play, they're looking and identifying a formation and evaluating the economics around that. And they must ask, what does the reservoir need, and what will the rock get back after fracturing? So the choice of fracturing fluid here selected will dictate the design, the types of additives required, the fate and transport of these fluids, and ultimately how these fluids are managed and disposed of. Again, because as Ron pointed out, this may not even involve water. Obviously, it's always going to involve some amounts of water, but we could be looking at a nitrogen foam, a CO2 frac, a LPG frac, some people are looking at these days. So, factors influencing HF fluid composition. The ideal properties of a fracturing fluid relate to its compatibility with the formation rock and fluids. And I'm going to come back in the next slide and discuss compatibility a little bit further, as I think this is becoming an important piece that operators are really keying in on. Also, its ability to transfer proppant throughout the target formation, and its ability to break down to a low viscosity for cleanup. Of course, because that's the whole intent here, again, with hydraulic fracturing. As Ron did a wonderful job of explaining, we're trying to move that proppant and put it in that target formation while then breaking down that flow and getting our flow back and ensuring that that proppant keeps that pore space open. There's an extensive variety of additives that may be included within the fracturing fluid mix to achieve these successful results. These are highly variable throughout all the unconventional formations. However, as you'll see on Frac Focus and with other things, the chemical additives generally only comprise about 0.5 to 1% of the overall HF fluid makeup. The rest is generally water and proppant. So key here, I think, is that operators should strive to minimize their overall use of fracturing additives while assessing the feasibility of maximizing their use of more environmentally benign solutions, which all of our service providers continue to develop, and they're continuing to invest more research on. So my first operators I'd like to highlight here are Encana and Apache and what they've done in the Horn River Basin in northeast British Columbia. What they've been able to do is they went and looked at the area, and they wanted to minimize their freshwater use. And of course, that's a theme here. You're going to hear me say minimizing freshwater use, key theme. But what they were able to do was identify a non-potable aquifer containing saline, sour water. This is the DeBolt water formation. And what they were able to develop was this innovative DeBolt water treatment plant. And tapping this source required innovation, including the investigation of several ways to sweeten or remove this hydrogen sulfide out of that water. But key to this, and circling back to that compatibility I mentioned earlier, I think that so many operators are looking at these non-potable sources, and I'm going to continue to talk about non-potable sources here, but it's that compatibility that I think people are beginning to think, if the natural formation fluids have been there for some time, and we fracture with something that's very much like those natural formation fluids, we may be able to enhance our production rates. And one of their early findings was that the DeBolt water was completely compatible with the Muskwa and Otter Park shales. And so not only did this present a great opportunity, but since June 2010, they were able to reduce up to 80% of their freshwater needs, or supply up to 80% of their freshwater needs with this DeBolt water. So obtaining water supply for hydraulic fracturing. When I talk about obtaining water supply, and let's think about if you are a company and you're analyzing this new formation and you're thinking and planning around entering this new basin. I mean, currently, Devon, we have 4 new venture plays, and that's what I'm doing day in and day out. We're working with teams to assess and evaluate and pre-plan and do a lot of upfront communication on this entry. I mean, one to highlight, I think, is a lot of people are looking at the Utica right now in eastern Ohio. And so key to this, and you're going to hear me continuously say communication, planning, but that's what we have to do. We have to have proactive communication and consultation with local, state, and regional water management agencies. That should always be a priority for every operator. This will safeguard your operations from disrupting local water needs. By doing this, by speaking with the people on the ground, as we've already mentioned, generally these state and local communities, state regulators are in the know. They know the most about their state's oil and gas management regulations. They know what's happening with competing interests, so you can get up there, begin to have these discussions with them, open the lines of communication. This also enhances your awareness of competing water needs. I mean, by having this communication, you may not have known of another industry's use or a new industry that's expected to come in. You can also maybe create a synergy, which I'll discuss later, with another wastewater stream. This will assist in the development of water acquisition and management plans, and will increase your understanding of permitting and regulatory requirements. So upon entering these new plays, you must consider this life cycle of water that we have to use from acquisition to disposal. You have to ask yourself questions like source water acquisition. Where will the necessary water supplies be acquired? Transport. How will the water be moved from source to the well site and ultimately to disposal? Storage. What requirements and constraints exist for water storage? What regulations are out there? Use. How will the water be used? What volume is required? And what must be done to achieve our fracturing objectives? Treatment and reuse recycle. Can the water produced be treated and recycled for use? And disposal. If the water can't be reused or recycled, what must be done? Operator has to go through all those steps and ultimately develop a toolbox approach and develop contingencies and be prepared if any of those change, that you're ready. And so we're going to continue to discuss that here with evaluating source water requirements. Again, when entering these new basins, operators should conduct a comprehensive evaluation of cumulative water demand on a programmatic basis. This review should include the timing, logistics, and accessibility of source water needs, and the adequacy of source waters. So I think logistics and timing are something that people often overlook, though. You know, we want to do the best we can. We put our best feet forward in developing and planning, but often people forget that we're in a competitive industry here. When you have a play like the Utica, you have people up there leasing those rights. And you're not out there forecasting and planning and telling all your friends and your other people in the industry about it. You're out there leasing what you can to ensure that you can get the lowest cost for that leasehold. And then you have to quickly develop it. And if you don't, generally a lease term maybe 3 years on some of this private land, and if you don't hold it, or HBP, held by production, if you don't get that leasehold held, then you have to go and release the land. So you got to understand logistics and timing here when planning all of this water management. You have to have that water be near where you plan to drill, be centralized. So you also have to think about, again, this toolbox approach, as I mentioned. You have to have several contingencies built in case of the timing, droughts, all these different things that may come up, even a flooding up here in the Northeast. So you have these different sources you're evaluating. Surface water, groundwater, both fresh and non-potable, municipal water supplies, treated wastewater from municipal and industrial treatment facilities, power plant cooling water, and recycled produced water and or flowback water. When you enter these basins, you can be evaluating all of these. And I'd like to highlight Noble Energy. I think they've been very forward-looking here. I think they've done a great job with evaluating this cumulative and comprehensive water demand. They're currently conducting their first water inventory to account for the direct water footprint throughout all of their domestic operations. And they will utilize this water footprint information to enhance and to identify their water reuse and recycling opportunities. And this management strategy is based on a continuous improvement cycle that will allow them to constantly collect this data, and then they can essentially evaluate and stress how they will be the most prudent with their use of water. So Noble's done a wonderful job of that. So as we turn our attention here and truly kind of look at each one of these different sources of water for acquisition, I'm going to start off with surface water. Surface water definitely requires a lot of communication and pre-planning. So operators should consider following potential impacts when evaluating the acquisition of surface waters. Again, I think I've mentioned this a couple of times, but timing and location is so important for surface, especially during low flow, during droughts, and times of competing demands. We've seen this for surface water use in several areas. I mean, when you're here in the Marcellus, generally you have an abundance of surface water and you see surplus. But when you go to areas such as Texas, you can't have all of your eggs in one basket and totally rely on surface waters when we have one of the worst summers on record. So also you should consider the ownership, allocation, or appropriation of water resources. This may require permitting from local, state, or multi-state regulatory agencies. Often in the West they have a lot of appropriated water rights. That takes a lot of pre-planning and permitting. Also up here, you're constantly working with groups such as the Delaware River Basin Commission or the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. So you must consider impacts to downstream habitats and users. This includes fish and wildlife. We continue to see more and more species making or potential listing for the Endangered Species Act. So we have to be thinking about this. And also reduce municipal drinking water supplies during drought conditions. A couple of more operators I'd like to highlight here are Range and Chesapeake Energy. They've done a tremendous job with utilizing these surplus surface water resources from the Susquehanna, Delaware, and others. And what they've been able to do is ultimately 100% reuse on all of their flowback. And how they're doing that is they're able to permit and use these remote level monitoring systems to permit the timing and volumes of withdrawals from these river systems. And they'll develop a centralized impoundment with security fencing. And then they'll receive the flowback, and the flowback may be anywhere from 10 to 20% of what they originally put down hole. And while it may be of poor quality, they're able to generally use some kind of simple filtration or clarification and then dilute this water and reuse it for all of their frac jobs. So they've done a wonderful job here. I'd also like to highlight Southwestern Energy and what they've been able to do in the Fayetteville Shale in Arkansas. Southwestern has actively been building retention ponds to increase their surface water storage. While this helps them to maximize and efficiently locate those water resources and centralize them, it also helps the local public, whether it be for agricultural purposes or recreational opportunities. You're promoting additional water resources for your surface owners. If you take one slide home, and I think I've already touched on this a little bit, but I think this is going to be my key slide for takeaway. I know I stand between you guys and lunch right now, but this is key, and this is where operators are going to. And historically, we have been limited by TDS and our fracturing additives, but we are overcoming that. And so whenever practicable, operators should consider using non-potable water sources for drilling and hydraulic fracturing needs. Historically, this may have been somewhat out of our reach. Now I think that we're going to begin putting a lot of attention into these non-potable aquifers. Again, we've had these TDS limitations, so we've needed these friction reducers that can overcome these high TDS water to ultimately go downhole and fracture these unconventional reservoirs. Well, now they've developed additives that allow us to overcome these TDS limitations. And so all of the many concerns expressed by the public, we may ultimately be avoided if we can minimize our industry's use of freshwater resources. And I know there's been so much attention, time, and money put into recycling. And I don't want to downgrade that or take anything away from that. Recycling is very important. We need to continue our recycling efforts and continue our drive for technical innovation in this field. But let me tell you this, we generally are going to receive 10 to 40% of our flow back. So no matter how efficient your recycling processes are, you're always going to need 90 to 60% makeup water. So we can completely get away from our freshwater use by identifying and using these non-potable water sources. For example, I pointed out here, many operators are using saline waters up to 30,000 ppm content as a water source for HF. Had I wrote that 1 year ago, that may have been accurate. Today, I'm actually hearing about operators using produced streams at 130,000 ppm. So while looking and evaluating these non-potable sources may require drilling deeper source water wells, it also may require having a little bit of additional constituents necessitating pre-treatment. But again, the concern is when we continue to utilize fresh groundwater resources or surface water sources during drought periods, there could potentially be a temporary and localized aquifer volume diminishment. And while we've seen some wonderful presentations, I was at a technical workshop with EPA, and we had several presentations that looked at multiple basins across the U.S. And generally when looking at these basins, oil and gas and our water use for hydraulic fracturing never accounted for greater than about 1.5% of the overall water use for each basin. So it's a minimal amount of water that our industry is using. However, we continue to get that public pushback. We can help ourselves get over that by looking at these sources.